Doris Angelton was born on April 11, 1951, and grew up in Lake Jackson, Texas. In 1973, she received her degree in speech therapy from the University of Texas at Austin. After graduation, Doris began working as a school teacher. She later changed careers to become a sales representative for a pharmaceutical company. In 1976, Doris met a man named William Beck. The couple married and settled near Clear Lake City, a suburb of Houston. A few years after that, when Doris was 28 years old, she was at a party and met a man named Robert Nicholas Angleton, who was called Bob. Bob was only a few years older than Doris, having been born in 1948. He came from a wealthy family. Bob graduated from college in New York City and worked briefly in his father's business. His father withdrew financial support after a series of arguments about a woman Bob was dating. Apparently, his father did not approve of his son's romantic choices. Bob opened a restaurant with his brother Roger, but the business failed. In the late 1970s, Bob and Roger moved to Houston, Texas. Bob sold used cars and Roger worked as a real estate agent. Going back to his relationship with Doris after meeting at that party, Doris and Bob felt a mutual attraction. They did not let the fact that they were both married to other people stand in their way. They divorced their respective spouses and married in 1982. In 1984, Doris gave birth to twins Nicole and Alessandra. In 1985, Bob was arrested for bookmaking, but was never convicted due to lack of evidence. Through this arrest experience, Bob became close to the Vice Squad officer who arrested him. He eventually became an unpaid informant for the police and provided information about his competitors. When the police arrested his competitors, he would take over their businesses. Bob was able to earn about $2 million a year doing this. He became the most influential bookie in the area, far ahead of the rest. When the police officer who had originally arrested Bob retired, he also took up bookmaking, believing that his experience as a police officer would make it so that he could never be caught. Bob ended up reporting him, and he was arrested. You could say that Bob got his revenge against that police officer. In January 1989, Bob hired his brother Roger to work in the bookmaking business. But Bob was dissatisfied with his brother's performance and fired Roger in August 1990. This led to a number of dramatic confrontations, including Roger's attempt to blackmail Bob. Perhaps Roger was jealous because Bob was incredibly successful. Bob and Doris lived in a $650,000 home in the prestigious River Oaks neighborhood of Houston. Bob owned a tennis club, a golf course, a beach house, and real estate in Colorado. He and his wife had a very comfortable lifestyle. The couple had everything they could want in terms of material possessions, but Doris was not happy emotionally. By 1996, Doris was complaining to her friends that there was no passion or intimacy in her marriage, and she was quite lonely. To connect with other people, Doris started chatting in a chat room for people over 40 on AOL. At the time, chat rooms were a relatively new invention. She used the nickname Doritos and was very popular in the chat room. Doris used a strategy that was familiar to her when she was unhappy in her marriage. She started cheating. She met a married man who lived in New Jersey. Doris was very unhappy with this undesirable status. She was also not happy that he was married. After meeting with her husband in Arizona and Texas, Doris decided it was time to end her marriage to Bob. She filed for divorce in February 1997, claiming 50% of the property she shared with her husband. Bob said he had $3 million in various bank safes around Houston. He told her he would give her half of it. Doris was convinced that Bob had more money than $3 million. To motivate him to offer her a better deal, she threatened to report her suspicions to the IRS. Despite this threat, from an external perspective, the divorce process seemed amicable. Bob even continued to live in the same house as Doris. The plan was for him to stay there until his daughters graduated that school year. On April 16, 1997, Doris and Bob were at a softball game with their daughters. Bob was the head coach of the team. He asked Doris to go home and pick up a baseball bat. Doris agreed and drove back to their shared house. Shortly after Doris entered through the side door of the house, she was shot 7 times in the head and 5 times in the body with a .22 caliber semi-automatic handgun. The attacker never had any physical contact with Doris other than the bullets. It appeared that Doris was completely caught off guard. Doris did not survive the attack. Meanwhile, Bob was still at the softball game with his daughters. When he noticed that Doris hadn't returned, he called and texted her, but to no avail. He picked up his daughters from the game and drove back to the house. When he arrived home, he found the side door open. Bob did not enter the house. Instead, he called 911. Police arrived, entered the house, and found Doris dead on the kitchen floor. Upon further investigation, police found that there were no signs of forced entry and that the security system had been deactivated. It had been turned on when they left the house. They found a small safe in one of the rooms. The door was open and there were wads of cash inside. It seemed that the intruder was not interested in taking anything. The police asked Bob who he thought might be responsible for the murder. After asking the police to turn off the audio recorder they were using, Bob told them it might be related to his illegal betting business. Bob also blamed his brother Roger. He told the police how he had fired Roger years earlier and about all the drama that followed. For example, in January 1997, Roger wrote Bob a threatening letter. The police began to treat Roger as a suspect. They found out that he was supposed to appear in court in California on the same day that Doris was killed, but he did not show up. On April 21st, 5 days after the murder, Roger arrived at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport with his luggage. He had 2 handguns in his luggage, .32 and .38 caliber. An X-ray technician discovered the guns during the screening, but Roger fled the airport before police could arrest him. Although the guns did not match the murder weapon, which was a .22 caliber pistol, police found something else in his luggage that linked Roger to the murder. There were handwritten notes containing information on how to kill Doris, including her schedule. Roger was arrested in a Las Vegas hotel after he provided police with a fake ID. He agreed to a search of his room. During the search, police found several key pieces of evidence: printed instructions on how to get into the Angelton family home, an audio cassette containing the voices of 2 men who were planning Doris's murder, $64,000 in cash. 2 of Bob's fingerprints were found on the money. It looked like Bob had paid Roger to kill Doris. Roger was arrested for the murder and transferred to a prison in Houston. He agreed to testify against his brother Bob, but he never had the chance to do so. On February 7th, 1998, 2 days before the plea agreement was to become official, Roger used a disposable razor to cut himself more than 50 times. He did not survive this suicide attempt. Roger left a suicide note in which he confessed to the murder and stated that his brother was not involved. Roger wrote that he tried to blame his brother, but Bob was innocent. This unexpected statement added a new twist to the investigation and cast doubt on the investigators' previous assumptions. Despite Roger's note proclaiming his brother's innocence, Bob Angelton was charged with murder. The prosecution knew that one male voice on the audio tape belonged to Roger, and they believed that the other voice belonged to Bob. It appeared that Roger had recorded his brother planning part of the murder, such as talking about how to deactivate the security system. The problem for the prosecution was that Bob's daughters testified that the second male voice did not belong to their father. In addition, the voice expert was 80% certain that the voice did not belong to Bob. This testimony created significant difficulties for the prosecution in trying to prove Bob's guilt. On August 12, 1998, 15 months after his wife's murder, Bob Angelton stood before a packed courtroom in Houston. Prosecutors insisted that the only person in the world who had a motive to shoot Doris was her husband. They argued that his older brother Roger had done him a favor by allowing Bob to avoid the divorce process initiated by his wife without going to court or the tax authorities. Despite the fact that their own experts were 80% sure that the voice on the tape did not belong to Bob, the prosecution took a chance and presented the audio recording as evidence. On the recording, the interlocutors discussed how to stage the attack on Doris as a robbery. Roger even asked if he needed to remove the ring from the woman's finger, to which his interlocutor replied that there was no need to cut the finger. The prosecution argued that only a person who had some kind of relationship with the victim during her lifetime could say such a thing. In another part of the recording, the men discussed what to do with the family dog, and it was decided to lock it in one of the bathrooms. The defense insisted that this conversation took place between Roger and the hired killer, whom he hired of his own free will, but this claim seemed unlikely. It was unlikely that any hired killer would care about a dog. But for Bob, who loved his dog, it would have mattered if his pet had been harmed. On the last day of the trial, the defense team finally fought back, calling the 14-year-old Angelton twins as witnesses. Both girls confirmed that the voice on the tape did not belong to their father. Their testimony could be understood from an emotional point of view. Having lost their mother instantly, they could not lose their second father. After 8 days of testimony, the jury began deliberating, trying to reach an agreement. It seemed that at first they supported the prosecution's case, and prosecutors were looking forward to their verdict. But when the jury announced its decision, everyone was shocked. The verdict stated that Robert Angelton was found not guilty. Bob Angelton's not guilty verdict shocked the entire community. It seemed that the crime was quite obvious, and there was little doubt as to who was responsible for Doris's death. However, Bob was acquitted. 2 months after the trial, Angelton agreed to pay the IRS $1,700,000. However, the FBI was not done with him yet. They continued to follow him, hoping that he would slip up and return to bookmaking. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation into Bob's betting activities. Federal prosecutors believed that the key to Robert's acquittal was the poor quality and mishandling of Roger's recording. In the conversation presented in court, it was impossible to make out a single word. This time, FBI experts began to study the tape. They digitized the recording and were able to significantly improve its quality. Vanessa Leggett, a journalist and investigator who had interviewed every witness in the case and had audio recordings of these conversations, was subpoenaed. Agents wanted to get what she knew, hoping to find some additional clues. But Leggett refused to cooperate. Vanessa claimed that she had journalistic privileges and should not disclose her sources or turn over the recordings. She justified her position by saying that she could not let down the people who had trusted her. Leggett was charged with contempt of court and sent to prison. It is ironic that while Leggett was in federal prison, Robert Angelton was walking the streets of Houston freely. After 6 months, Leggett was released because federal prosecutors decided to continue the investigation without her help. Instead, they arrested Robert Angelton on federal charges of conspiracy to commit a murder for hire and unlawful possession of a firearm. The reason they were able to use this was because Robert had transported Roger across state lines from San Diego to commit the crime for him. The trial was to begin in Houston. Robert refused bail and turned the federal case into an international drama. 6 years after Doris Angelton's murder, her husband Robert was due to appear in federal court. The hearing was scheduled for June 12th, but Robert did not show up. He somehow managed to escape. Robert's life on the run was short-lived. He was detained at the Amsterdam International Airport with a fake passport. The customs officer, who noticed the discrepancy in identification, decided to conduct a full inspection of the passenger's belongings. The search revealed $135,000 in cash and several other documents with different names. However, there was another obstacle to Robert's return to Houston. The Dutch government rejected the U.S. extradition request. The only way out was to abandon prosecution on more serious charges and charge him only with tax evasion, money laundering, and forgery. Robert's flight from justice ended in 2004 when the Dutch government finally agreed to conditional extradition. 3 months later, Robert pleaded guilty to the charges. His total sentence was 12 years and 3 months, and he was to be released in 2014. The agreement with the Netherlands allowed the feds to re-indict Robert for conspiracy to murder Doris as soon as he was released, and everyone expected that to happen. Angelton was released from prison in 2012. He did not wait for new charges and escaped again. Unfortunately, Robert was never brought to trial for organizing the crime against his wife. When investigators looked into Robert's motives, they found that he had much more to lose in the event of a divorce than anyone could have guessed. In February 1997, Doris initiated divorce proceedings, demanding 50% of all assets. Robert offered her half of his estimated wealth, $1,500,000. Doris suspected that this was not the full amount and wanted to proceed legally. She consulted with a lawyer who explained that the only way to do this was to file a tax return that would disclose all of Robert's income. If this happened, Robert could lose everything and, moreover, end up in prison because of his betting activities. The detectives assumed that, not wanting to part with his money, the man made a deal with his older brother. The plan was for Roger to do the dirty work and then disappear. Robert Angelton knew that the police would not rest until they uncovered the truth and found the person who shot Doris. He needed to provide himself with an ironclad alibi and provide them with a potential criminal to absolve himself of all responsibility. The essence of Roger's story, which he confided to journalist Vanessa Leggett, was that after signing a contract with his brother, according to which Robert was to pay him $1 million, he doubted that his brother would not deceive him. So he recorded a conversation with him on tape. He wanted to use these recordings as leverage in case Robert refused to pay him the agreed amount for the elimination of his wife. He knew his brother well and realized that he would do anything to avoid paying. The Angeltons hoped that Roger would manage to change his identity and go underground. They were confident that the police would not be able to gather all the case materials together. On the evening of the softball game, Robert probably deliberately left the baseball bat in the backyard so that Doris, having entered the house through the front door, would walk down the hallway through the entire house. Roger showed up at his brother's house in advance, was able to disable the alarm, get inside, and just wait for the woman to come home and walk past him. When that happened, Roger shot Doris at close range, and when she fell, he simply unloaded both guns into her to deprive her of any chance of survival. Doris knew too much and was becoming a burden. The media exploded when suspicion fell on Robert Angelton. They almost immediately declared him the organizer of the crime against his wife when they learned that his older brother Roger had been arrested in Las Vegas. The situation was complicated by the fact that Roger was reluctant to discuss his actions with detectives. The only person he decided to confide in was reporter and investigator Vanessa Leggett, and that was only on the condition that she would keep his secrets until the end of the trial. The entire community was shocked when Robert Angelton was found not guilty of Doris's murder. It seemed that the crime was quite obvious, and there was little doubt as to who was responsible for Doris's death. However, Bob was acquitted. This decision caused a lot of discussion and controversy in the community. Even though Robert Angelton was acquitted of Doris's murder, many questions remained unanswered. Why did Roger record the conversation about planning the murder? If it was not Robert's voice on the recording, whose voice was it? Why did Roger commit suicide, leaving a note absolving his brother of responsibility? Furthermore, it remains a mystery why Robert fled when he was facing federal charges. If he was innocent of Doris's murder, why didn't he stay to defend himself in court? These and other questions continue to surround the Doris Angelton case, making it one of the most enigmatic and debated crime stories.